Honourable Senators, it was remiss of me when last we met on the 17th of March 2020 to not advise that in our collective resolve to curb the spread of the coronavirus COVID-19, the Parliament had taken steps to provide members and staff with a safe environment to conduct its parliamentary business. Among the steps taken, you would have observed at our last sitting, in accordance with the guidelines provided by the World Health Organization, our seating had been reconfigured to facilitate social distancing. Above and beyond our adjusted seating arrangements, I had discussed with the leaders and the coordinator other measures that we have taken, such as the requirement to sanitize one's hands on entry into the Red House and Cabildo building, and that we have in the Parliament instituted daily sanitizing and steaming of workspaces and other areas within this building. The COVID-19 virus has, on the administrative side, been engaging the attention of the presiding officers and the clerks of the House and Senate for quite some time. On the business of the Senate side, it is to be noted that since the 28th of January 2020, while there were 2 matters of urgent public importance raised and not allowed because of the high threshold required, some 14 urgent questions with the attendant 2 supplemental questions have been allowed and discussed. As we begin this extraordinary sitting, I give you, fellow senators and the national community, the assurance that this Senate is, has been, and remains committed to playing its part in the collective national effort to meet the challenges of and ultimately to triumph over COVID-19.
Bills brought from the House of Representatives. The Miscellaneous Provisions 2019 Novel Coronavirus 2019 NCOV Bill 2020 in the name of the Attorney General.
Attorney General.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, in accordance with Standing Order 62(1)(b), I beg to move that the next stage of the bill be taken forthwith.
Honourable Senators, the question is that the next stage of the bill be taken forthwith. All in favour say aye. Aye. Any against? The ayes have it.
Public Business, Government Business Bill, second reading.
Before I call on the Honourable Attorney General, may I ask the Leader of Government Business whether there has been agreement between the benches according to Standing Order 117?
Madam President, there has been no agreement.
Attorney General.
Much obliged. Before I begin, in the House, Madam Speaker and Madam President, just a short while ago in the House, the Speaker had announced that we would have a limit on time. Is it that the question passed a moment ago was that there is regular speaking time in existence and not the truncated time that the House agreed to?
That is correct, Attorney General. In the House, there was a different scenario, and while it's an extraordinary sitting in extraordinary circumstances, perhaps the standing orders could have been utilized. That's what they're there for. From what the Leader of Government Business has told me, there is no such agreement. So you can continue and you have your normal speaking time.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I do not propose to use my full speaking time, hopefully, because I thought that it was a sensible move in the House that we had engaged. Madam President, I beg to move that a bill entitled An Act to Amend the Cinematograph Act, Chapter 2010, the Registration of Clubs Act, Chapter 2101, the Theatres and Dance Halls Act, Chapter 2103, the Motor Vehicles and Road Traffic Act, Chapter 4850, the Companies Act, Chapter 8101, the Bills of Sale Act, Chapter 8232, the Money Lenders Act, Chapter 8404, the Pawnbrokers Act, Chapter 8405, the Licensing of Dealers, Precious Metals and Stones Act, Chapter 8406, and the Public Health Ordinance, Chapter 12, Number 4, in response to the 2019 novel coronavirus 2019 NCOV, and for related matters be now read a second time. Madam President, I stand in extraordinary sitting of this Honorable Senate, having just completed an extraordinary sitting of the House of Representatives. Certainly in my near 10 years in this Parliament as a legislator, it's the first time I've had the pleasure of sitting in both Houses of Parliament on the same day, on the same issue. I think that the parliamentary staff and that honourable members are to be commended collectively for seeing such efficient work of the Parliament come for the benefit of the people of Trinidad and Tobago. Madam President, as a matter of fact and record, I wish to premise this debate in the context of the following milestones that this country has witnessed. Madam President, the situation of the development of what was then known as the coronavirus in the outbreak which started in Wuhan province in China began at the early part of this year, the latter part of last year. Indeed, the world was put upon caution of the need to treat with infectious circumstances coming from the virus. Madam President, we in Trinidad and Tobago paid very careful attention to these developments. We looked at the situation in China and we took note as a cabinet and as a government of the need to exercise care and caution. Indeed, we were approaching the carnival period at that point, and the government, notwithstanding our excellent historical relationship with the government of China and the People's Republic of China, we having been one of the first countries in the world to recognize China in that way. Trinidad and Tobago under Dr. Eric Williams was one of the first countries in the world to establish relationships with China in a one China policy arrangement. We took a deliberate position evidenced by a cabinet note and minute of January 28, 2020, which dealt with proposed travel restrictions to minimize the risk of the importation of the 2019 novel coronavirus into Trinidad and Tobago. By virtue of the Cabinet's function under its prerogative and powers, certainly under the Constitution, Section 79 of the Constitution, vests the executive authority in the Cabinet. We had the Minister of Health agree, and the Cabinet took the decision with immediate effect to treat with persons who are at present living in or visiting China to be prohibited entry into Trinidad and Tobago where they have departed China within a 14-day period. That, fortunately for us, Madam President, left us in a situation where we managed to look at what the WHO's period for infection looked like, which was 14 days, look to see if flu-like symptoms developed in that time, and therefore we could screen better the entry of persons into Trinidad and Tobago. Madam President, by virtue of Legal Supplement Part B, Volume 59, Number 11, on the 31st of January 2020, Her Excellency Paula May Weeks, the President of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, by virtue of Cabinet request and decision, issued a proclamation declaring 2019 novel coronavirus to be a dangerous infectious disease. That was issued pursuant to the existing laws of Trinidad and Tobago, and that is in particular the provisions of the Public Health Ordinance, Chapter 12, Number 2. Number 4. Madam President, that step of declaring the coronavirus as we have, and that is as a dangerous infectious disease, triggered the ability in Trinidad and Tobago, which we published in legal notice also dated the 31st of January 2020, under the Quarantine Act, Chapter 2805. By that order, we allowed for the coronavirus, the novel coronavirus, to be treated under the quarantine provisions. Madam President, Carnival was upon us. Fortunately, now we are able to say, insofar as there have been very few cases, 9 as at today's date, COVID confirmation cases, we know for sure that those steps resulted in Carnival coming and going without any recorded infection of the COVID virus. Madam President, on the 27th of February 2020, by cabinet decision, we put further measures for restriction for the COVID virus into place. And in particular, we further limited a number of jurisdictions in the same quarantine aspect and prevention of travel aspect. Those jurisdictions included much of the APG, the Asia Pacific Group. As we now know, Korea, etc., we introduced those restrictions. And very importantly, we established a multi-sectoral committee comprising the Chief Medical Officer as chair. And I'd like to stick a pin and pay a huge public compliment to the Chief Medical Officer, Dr. Roshan Parasram, who has stepped up to the plate of Trinidad and Tobago's performance as a public servant, but who has done so with a measure of calm, a measure of precision, ably assisted by someone who has risen as a star in this country, Dr. Michelle Trotman, who has also, through a very measured communication, joined the Minister of Health, who has been leading the communication effort on behalf of the government, together with the Minister of National Security, then joined by the Prime Minister and the Minister of Labour and several of our colleagues, social development, finance, etc., in speaking to this issue. These members were added to that special committee, the following members: Chief of Defence Staff, Immigration Office of CIO, the Commissioner of Police, representatives from the Office of the Prime Minister, Ministry of Finance, Ministry of Works, Education, Rural Development, Tourism, Trade, Foreign Affairs, National Security, Communications, Social Development, Airports Authority, Civil Aviation Authority, Port Authority, Office of Disaster Preparedness, the Commissioner of Police, the Tobago House of Assembly, the Tobago Emergency Management Authority, and they were mandated to translate and operationalize the WHO strategy. Madam President, on the basis of the multi-sectoral work, the Minister of Health has been able to create a parallel healthcare system, adding hundreds of beds with technical capacity, having masks, testing kits, a protocol of procedure for dissemination of information. And what we are looking at, which has now become quite common in terms of reference, is the flattening of the curve. The flattening of the curve refers to avoiding a peak spike in infections in your community, in Trinidad and Tobago, which peak spike in the number of people infected could inundate your healthcare system. If your healthcare system is inundated, it means that the people most in need of medical attention in our healthcare institutions will be struggling for space and medical attention, and therefore there is a direct risk to mortality. The death rate can potentially climb. We've seen that in a number of countries, in Italy, in Europe, as we're seeing it unfold, in the United States of America. That spike is what you refer to as in need of flattening. And what flattening means is controlling your infection and management of infectious disease over a longer space of time within the capacity of your healthcare system. Obviously, not being a doctor, but understanding that which has been communicated by others so far, it is intended that the population will over time recover in a measured way from infection and therefore have a form of immunity in the population of Trinidad and Tobago. We're blessed to have a medical practitioner of distinction with us in the Senate today, and I'm sure that we will hear from the Honourable Senator as to the technicalities of this. Madam President, permit me to say before I get to the next milestone, we are in unprecedented times. The last time that Trinidad and Tobago experienced an event like this of significant measure was in 1920 with the Spanish flu. 40 to 50 million people died in the Spanish flu in 1920. I was regaled with stories from my grandfather, Lionel Sukaran, of the typhoid experience in Trinidad and Tobago. We've had infectious diseases before, but our population in terms of size, our economy in terms of structure, has not been certainly under the experience that we're experiencing now. The phrase is that we must expect the unexpected. We are not in the position of responsibility for the management of this situation, this pandemic, lying in one quarter alone. The Prime Minister, the Honorable Dr. Keith Rowley, correctly surmised and put out that this is a four-pronged obligation. The state, the private sector, labor, and the individual. There are four elements in this equation, four parts in this equation. I want to draw a very important distinction as it will arise in the context of this bill. The bill before us is intended to treat by way of statute effectively a hold on matters which would expire. Your driver's license, your motor vehicle registration, your inspection certificate, the need to file your company's returns across the company's registry landscape, the ability to treat with your licenses which will expire, liquor license, cinematograph, pawnbrokers, precious metals, money lenders. All of those events require you to attend at a public place, have reports from public officers, for instance, public health officers, inspectors, etc., pay in a public place in a confined environment, and the measures before us today are intended to effectively have a validation of all existing licenses, provisions, etc., under the various 10 pieces of law that we touch, have them valid and kept in valid state, notwithstanding their expiry, notwithstanding the need to come to the public institutions to extend them. We come now with as many as we can find to preserve the validity. We allow a formula which says that this shall be in respect of anything which expires prior to the 27th of March 2020 and including the period 27th of March 2020 to the 31st of July 2020. Then we take a further point. We say the validity shall prevail up until August 31st, meaning if July 31st comes upon you, you can engage in the renewal process in the period July 31st to August 31st. We put a very careful caveat. We allow across the 10 laws the ability of the minister with responsibility for management of those laws to extend the time frame, the deadline dates by order, meaning a stroke of a pen, depending upon the circumstances that Trinidad and Tobago is in, the stroke of a pen can extend the date and therefore continue in validity. In this environment, Madam President, I was about to say, this is not your typical position as we've experienced with states of emergency. We can treat with infectious diseases and dangerous infectious diseases in law in a few formulae. Number one, by virtue of Section 8 of the Constitution, where you have the emergency powers under a state of emergency. Number two, under the Disaster Management Act, where you can declare parts of Trinidad and Tobago, arguably the whole of Trinidad and Tobago, as a disaster area, and therefore go into measures similar to a state of emergency. Number three, you can amend miscellaneous provisions of the law. Number four, you can take the Public Health Ordinance, which is an ordinance when we were a crown colony, birthed in 1917, and invoke the powers of the minister described in that old law as a board, where you can take public health measures for and in respect of an infectious disease or a dangerous infectious disease. So let's tie it up now. COVID-19 is a dangerous infectious disease. January 31st, 2020, Her Excellency the President made that proclamation at the Cabinet's request. Step two, we're under the public health arrangements, under the Public Health Ordinance. We are not under a state of emergency, Section 8 provision. Under the state of emergency, Section 8 provision, we would have the ability to manage certain regulations. But what we are accustomed to from those of us old enough to remember our experiences under state of emergency, in the traditional state of emergency context where you've had a curfew, people still went to work, production still happened, jobs were still preserved, money could be made, taxes could be paid, the government could run. So point number one in expect the unexpected is this is not a normal situation. Point number two, we are looking in the context of this bill as to our revenue. We are not the United States of America, whose currency is pegged on a fiat, meaning there is no backing to the US dollar. They don't have gold bullion, they don't have reserves of certain currencies. They can print money. An act of their respective cycle says print $5 billion and spend it. In Trinidad and Tobago, we must back our currency. We must have reserves for our currency, and therefore preserving our reserves requires us to earn money. To earn money, the last point to not forget is the most important. We earn money by the sale of our oil and gas, in large measure, supplemental petroleum taxes, corporation taxes, pay as you earn taxes. That is what allows the government to pay the bills and keep the lights on. Now, I've said that because no doubt the population listening into this debate is concerned about relief measures, how we will manage our situation. I want to put onto the record, this is a dynamic situation which is flowing day by day. The Cabinet, through the Honorable Prime Minister, has demonstrated, pursuant to the provisions of Section 79 of the Constitution, that we asked for the population to self-regulate. We gave guidelines, we gave parameters, we asked for people to socially distance. We're doing it here in this Parliament. The next step that we are taking today is preservation of liability, but yesterday, we issued a legal notice invoking regulations under Section 105 of the Public Health Ordinance, and we put in regulations to say, number one, bars, and I put that in inverted commas because it's not a defined concept, which are licensed, should not open for the sale of their liquor licensing. Two, that restaurants should not have in-house dining. Three, that there would be an offense of 6 months. That's the maximum exposure that you have if you are found in those circumstances. It's important to note that we are here today in the bill amending the Public Health Ordinance because Section 105.3 currently has a dollar fine of $480 and 6 months. In the law, you must say in your regulations what the offense includes, which is why in the regulations gazetted yesterday, we had those regulations. Those regulations have been amended already because the period that we are offering is 1 month. It expires on the 20th of April. Those regulations have involved, in terms of something which was circulated, the view that in-house hotels had to be temporarily managed because we're aware that people are still at the hotels. But I want to caution that today we will issue a replacement to these regulations because obviously if the Senate approves the amendments, we need to include the penalty by way of fine, which is currently not in the law, more than $480. Also, we will be adding in a prohibition against cinemas operating. The Cinematograph Act, the Honorable Prime Minister gave that instruction. So I'm warning the population, be on the alert in the expect the unexpected regime that we're in right now, that there will be constant adjustment as we move. Why is this happening? This is happening because despite the attempts at moral suasion, some of our citizens are insistent on congregating in manners that they ought not to. Madam President, please also expect in this scenario that we are going to have a situation where we have to have administrative relief happen. We as a parliament are doing the bills before us now, the acts before us, but the administrative management has gone into cycle as well. The judiciary, by way of practice direction, has issued the closure other than order urgent matters. the Industrial Court, the Equal Opportunities Tribunal, the Tax Appeal Court, all of which fall under the coordination of the Attorney General. We harmonized that. At the Attorney General's office, I would love to have had the fanfare of some very hard work applied to something which happened yesterday. Yesterday, as Attorney General, I had the pleasure of launching the first ever online payment system for a government division. At the Attorney General's Office, Legal Affairs, we see 15,000 people every 3 days. Today, on our new website, which we are copying and pasting to all other divisions of government, as a result of the financial instructions which I drafted together with my team, as a result of procurement which we put into place, as a result of cabinet decisions taken over a year ago, and with the digitizing of millions of records and documents, Licensing Division, Intellectual Property Office, Registrar General, births, deaths, companies, deeds. We had 1,000 visitors to that website already this morning, and we have had transactions flowing. So you order your birth certificate online, you pay for it online, and we deliver it to you via TT Post, Madam President. This is something this country has spoken about for decades, but nobody did the work to operationalize it. You've heard me time and time again talk about plant and machinery, people, processes, and then law. So, Madam President, I would love to underline and stress right now the benefit of what we at AG's office have accomplished. Works and Transport is next. Licensing will be cutting and pasting that on the 2nd of April, and we move across every government division. Because this is an opportunity for innovation. Amazon today hired 100,000 people to deliver. Businesses in Trinidad and Tobago can engage not in congregation, but in delivery in a manner that is appropriate to the protocols. Social distancing, careful contact, sanitization. I actually believe that out of this crisis, we have the ability to reinvent ourselves so that persons who are affected in a temporary loss of employment, and let me stress, this is temporary. This will come to an end. The question is, do we have the resolve and the measure to encourage orderly compliance as a nation? I believe that the approach is really best achieved if we take this in a careful way. The risk that is upon us is community infection. Community infection is the 3-to-1 ratio, where 1 infects 3 and 3 becomes 9 and 9 goes as you treat with the multiples of exponential growth. We have to manage this in extraordinary measure, in an extraordinary way. But the way that that must be achieved is firstly together, with a special resolve for calmness, with an insistence that we agree to comply. Madam President, it's not that we all don't immediately feel the impact to thousands. Obviously, the closure of bars and casinos affect thousands. The Minister of Finance will be approaching the Parliament next week to carry out further economic measures to deal as a government with the fallout that we are having. But remember the 4 parts formula: labor, individual, public sector, and private sector. No one sector can absorb all of this. Many businessmen have already, landlords have already started to defer rental or skip rental entirely. Banks, credit unions, all of these are being communicated as we speak. The Ministry of Social Development has given a wholesome package of reliefs and benefits. The Ministry of Finance, I don't think members would ever have thought that we would have seen credit card interest fall from 24% to 14%, and for limits under 25,000 to 10%. We've seen a 3% drop in prime. All of this happened by the government engaging the banking sector. Right now, as the data comes into us as a country, and we see the effect upon the very most vulnerable aspects of our community, our elderly, our single mothers, our quote-unquote small man and small woman, that's where the government in data will be able to provide the solutions that we offer. So my message to Trinidad and Tobago is to have hope and faith, be calm, exercise sensibility, exercise patience, and very importantly, be assured that the measures that we have before us, Madam President, are important measures. At the Solicitor General's office, we have introduced e-filing. You can serve your claims by virtue of email or drop-off. We have established hotlines across divisions. In this bill, you'll see we're amending the Bills of Sales Act. Some people may not be familiar with that. Bills of sales statistically rank second in volume to deeds. We register roughly about 27,000 deeds per year. In terms of numbers, bills of sales are at 22,000. But you only have a 7-day period after which it's void, and then you must approach the court by way of an application to the court by fixed date claim form to get a court order to extend it or to re-register it. This bill before us now keeps the validity of the instrument alive, allows for the extension of time by way of the statute deeming it to be valid, and therefore removes the need to approach the court, approach the registry. You can take your time. As our e-payment cycle and our e-filing cycle gets into more spread across the government, and I wish to genuinely say this, I am grateful that we did this years ago, because the exercise of e-filing and e-payment started in 2015. But to do that, you had to digitize the data. You can't just e-pay if everything is on paper. Millions of records had to be digitized, and that is what we have been doing for the time that we have been engaged in this process. Madam President, the bill itself is straightforward. Clause 1 is the short title. Clause 2, we treat with the amendments to the Motor Vehicle and Road Traffic Act. We are, courtesy, a recommendation coming from the House, which was not in the bill we had originally contemplated. We have introduced the validity of transfers of motor vehicles so that we're preserving the opportunity to not have to go into effect your transfer and be in an offense circumstance. So you don't need to register your transfers until after we have passed this thing. We have also extended the validity of all documents, including motor vehicle inspections. Motor vehicle inspections, by a combination of Section 4 of the Motor Vehicle and Road Traffic Act, together with Section 26 of that Act, you don't need to inspect your vehicles in this pandemic period. Companies Act, we're giving an amnesty. There will be no penalty for non-filings for all documents in the formula that we prescribe, and that is till the 31st of July, or such period as may be extended. Bills of sales, I've just referred to, we're making sure that you don't have the obligation to act within the 7 days for registration and re-registration. We are preserving what we would call loosely the pandemic period as a validity period. We are in the public health ordinance. We're going to amend the $480 fine up to a maximum of $50,000. It's not that you're going to automatically be exposed to that. The Interpretation Act and the case law says that the judicial discretion is the one that says how much you are going to pay and what your liability to an offense is. So the upper limit is $50,000. The law since 1917 said 6 months. And we're going to leave that the way it is. The Cinematograph Act, the Registration of Clubs Act, Theatres and Dance Halls Act, the Money Lenders Act, the Pawnbrokers Act, the Licensing of Dealers, Precious Metals and Stones Act, the Old Metal and Marine Stores Act, all of those, clauses 6 to clauses 12 inclusive, that is the validation period being kept open, again with the caveat that we can extend by way of order. Madam President, we believe certainly that we don't know everything, that there will be need to adjust. We are well familiar in the Senate with my maxim of just start. The Parliament is here to work. I wish to pay a public compliment to the hard-working essential services in Trinidad and Tobago, who, by the way, include the supermarket attendants. I want to pay tribute to the innovation of Trinidad and Tobago. That innovation includes True Value saying, put your order by WhatsApp, we'll fill your bag and you can collect it. We are innovating our way out of this circumstance. I look forward to contributions from honorable members in this debate, and I beg to move.
Honourable Senators, I shall now propose the question for debate. The question is that a bill entitled An Act to Amend the Cinematograph Act, Chapter 2010, the Registration of Clubs Act, Chapter 2101, the Theatres and Dance Halls Act, Chapter 2103, the Motor Vehicles and Road Traffic Act, Chapter 4850, the Companies Act, Chapter 8101, the Bills of Sale Act, Chapter 8232, the Money Lenders Act, Chapter 8404, the Pawnbrokers Act, Chapter 8405, the Licensing of Dealers, Precious Metals and Stones Act, Chapter 8406, and the Public Health Ordinance, Chapter 12, Number 4, in response to the 2019 novel coronavirus 2019 nCoV and for related matters, be now read a second time. Senator Mark.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Madam President, we on this side are committed to doing everything in our power to ensure that the health, safety, and security of the people of TNT is given number one priority in this very uncertain and unpredictable period that our country is currently experiencing. Madam President, whatever we do, we have to ensure that there is equity, there is transparency, there is accountability in rolling out the various measures that we are participating in, debating today and in the coming days. Madam President, there's no doubt that the global pandemic brought about by this new enemy of the global community called the coronavirus requires unity, solidarity, and a common purpose in achieving a particular objective, which would be, Madam President, the complete elimination of this threat to our humanity. Madam President, today as we speak, the number of cases near 250,000. In Italy alone, 612 persons have died only in one day. Madam President, in that country alone, you have a record of over 4,000 deaths. After China, largest in the global community. In the global community, overall, we have had 10,000 deaths. So we know it is serious business that we are facing. In our own country, we have been advised by bulletins that are released by the Minister of Health and the Ministry of Health that thus far there are 9 confirmed cases. Luckily, fortunately, and I hope it stays that way, we have had no deaths thus far. That is extremely good. The Attorney General, like so many others, have been talking about the flattening of the curve. The situation is unprecedented and very abnormal. That is a fact. So, Madam President, we have to ensure that, as we have been advised, that from one level to another, and we have to do everything to protect that next level, which is community infection. We have to do everything in our power to avoid that. And in a war, you must have ammunition, otherwise you can't fight. And therefore, we have to ensure that there is capacity, the relevant and necessary resources for those who are in the front line, particularly our health care professionals and workers, nurses, and the rest, technicians who are involved in the healthcare business, Madam President. Madam President, I just want to indicate, before I get into the bill itself, I want to commend an article which I read in The Guardian of London, dated Wednesday, 18th of March, 2020. And this article, to deal with the very issue of community infection and avoiding that, indicated in an article entitled, "Scientists Say Mass Tests in Italian Town Have Halted COVID-19." Mass tests have halted COVID-19. And Madam President, I just want to share with you and this Honorable Senate what this article said in part. I'm not going to bore you. This small town called Vo in northern Italy had experienced a coronavirus death. And Madam President, scientists went into that town and they conducted a major exercise where the inhabitants of that town total 3,300 inhabitants in that area. And Madam President, they conducted tests on every inhabitant, asymptomatic, symptomatic. Everyone was tested twice, not once, twice, Madam President. And Madam President, because of this approach that they took in this place called Vo, Italy, they were able to eliminate, Madam President, the submerged infections, and they isolated them. Madam President, that research in that country called Vo in northern Italy revealed that at least 6 asymptomatic people were tested positive. Those are people, Madam President, like you and me, were walking about in Vo, and nobody knew that they were infected. but because of the mass tests that they conducted in that part of northern Italy, 6 normal human beings, asymptomatic, were tested positive for COVID-19. And Madam President, the story is, if these people had not been discovered and had not been tested, they would have been spreading COVID-19, the coronavirus, unknowingly to other persons in the community. I raise this point, Madam President, and I want to commend this article to the Attorney General and to the Minister of Health, Madam President, to see what lessons we can draw. Because this now is supported by the World Health Organization. That is why its Secretary or Director General indicated to all of us, Madam President, in a news conference, if it's one message you want to leave with all these countries that are fighting this global, invisible, and deadly enemy, is test, test, and test. So I want to tell the government of this country, test, test, and test. And if you have to get resources to do that, as they did in Korea, as they're doing in America, Madam President, we do it because our first responsibility is to save the lives of citizens in our country. So I wanted to tell you, Madam President, this is a matter of grave importance, and we have to avoid. Get the resources, test people, whether they're asymptomatic or not, test them. Madam President, as we go to the actual bill itself, I would like the Attorney General to tell us whether, Madam President, the legal notice that reference was made to in the contribution of the Attorney General, whether legal notice 54 has been revoked or does it still stand? Because we know there are 2 legal notices, one without a number and one with a number. One that says 5 months to close your bars and your casino and serve meals via delivery as it relates to restaurants. And now, Madam President, the bill that we have before us today has included a number of other bodies. But as it relates to the legal notice, I would like the Attorney General, when he's winding up, to indicate this Honorable Senate, which one is legal. Is it 54 or the one that came out yesterday evening, moving the date for the regulations to go into force from the 21st of March 2020 and expire on the 31st of July 2020? Or is it the one that came out without a legal notice number that says the regulation come into force on the 21st of March 2020 and expire on the 20th of April 2020? Clear the air, clarify for the population. Madam President, as we move on, the area that I am going to try to clarify, and let me indicate from the outset, whatever we are doing on this side of the House is designed to strengthen the legislation. We are in this thing, as the Prime Minister said, together. So we want to strengthen the legislation that is before us, Madam President. And this is why this clause, Madam President, that we have on what is called, I think, Section 5, Clause 5, I should say, dealing with the public health ordinance, is the one that I want to deal with. And I want to relate it to the legal notice, which I have a copy of. And this is the only legal one I can deal with, Madam President, because it's the only one that is legally available and I can refer to properly before this Honorable Senate. And in this legal notice, Madam President, we advise of the issuing of regulations, new regulations, under Section 105 of the Public Health Ordinance. And in Section 2 of that particular legal notice, it states that an offense is committed under Regulation 3. If any person were to conduct the business of a bar, whether or not the person is a licensed person under the Liquor Licenses Act. B, to operate a club as defined in Section 2 of the Registration of Clubs Act. Casinos, Madam President. C, to provide the amenity of seated dining at a restaurant to any customer. So that deals with, I guess that deals with rituals, KFC, restaurants throughout our country, Madam President. Just to name a few. Madam President, I did not see in the amendments before us the inclusion of churches. I know places of worship, I'm talking about here, thank you. Places of worship, Madam President. Not the mainstream churches, Madam President, have, from my perspective, adhere and comply, and they're doing what they can to keep their congregation alive and not congregate. They must be complemented. But, Madam President, other places of worship, how is the state, how is the government seeking, Madam President, to address that? Only, I think, a couple hours ago, there was a big service somewhere in the country. It was in the newspapers, and people were congregated, gathered together. So that is an area, Madam President, we would like the Attorney General to clear and clarify where in the law are we going to address this. Madam President, the other area I would like to have clarified is malls. What are we doing with malls where you have mass gathering of people? Madam President, the government must have a policy as it relates to malls. What is going to happen? Now, we know it have all kinds of things in a mall, including supermarkets, right? But we are talking about a legal notice that is calling on bars to shut their doors. That is why I made the point, Madam President, whatever we do, we must always exercise equity, transparency in all that we do, so that no one comes to the conclusion that there is some subtle discrimination, in inverted commas, being exercised by lawmakers against them. So we have, Madam President, to be extremely careful. So churches and the malls, or worship, places of worship, I should say, and the malls, we want to get some clarification, or we would like to have clarification. Madam President, the Attorney General may want to tell us as well, how do we deal with certificate of good character, or what is called COC? We understand that the police, TTPS, has suspended the issuance of COC. Some statement, I understand, was issued by the Commissioner of Police Office to that effect. If that is so, Madam President, you would know that there are many people who need to get COC or certificates of character from the police to take to the immigration, merely for them to have an extension of their work permit in Trinidad and Tobago, persons who are non-nationals, as an example. So transactions that have to be conducted with a COC, how do we address those matters? Are we also going to have, Madam President, an amendment to the law that would give people up to the 31st of July or the 31st of August, Madam President, if it is being suspended by the Commissioner of Police or by the TTPS? These are matters, Madam President, we would like to have clarified. Madam President, let us go to this clause 5 of the Public Health Ordinance and look at exactly what is being proposed. The Public Health Ordinance, as you are aware, Madam President, from my basic arithmetic, is 103 years old. It came into existence in 1917 under the colonialists or the colonial regime. So this is the law under Clause 5 or the ordinance that is being amended in what is called Section 105, Madam President. And what 105 says, Madam President, is that there may be attached by way of penalty to any breach of any regulation made under this section a fine not exceeding $50,000 and a term of imprisonment not exceeding 6 months. Madam President, I would like to say that when it comes to this provision in the legislation, we have to be very mindful of what is contained in the Parent Act as we seek to amend it in this miscellaneous provision bill that is before us. Madam President, there appears to be a clash or a collision between what is called primary legislation and subsidiary legislation. In the United Kingdom, it is referred to as delegation or delegated legislation. Madam President, I want to make it very clear, and I want the Attorney General to ponder on this submission very carefully. And that has to do with the fact that when you go to the legislation, which I'll show to this Honorable House in a short while, there's no provision dealing with the regulations and the power of the minister to make regulations that gives the minister of health, or give us as parliamentarians the power to curtail commercial or business activities in Trinidad and Tobago. The regulations under 105 do not give us in this parliament the power to curtail people's commercial or business activities. Madam President, may I remind you, every citizen has the right to enjoyment of property. Every person. And every person has a right to assembly and association. And therefore, I am submitting to this Honorable Senate that regulations cannot exceed the authority of the enabling statute. Regulations, Madam President, must not be ultra vires of the primary law or act. And Madam President, if you go to 105 of the Parent Act, which is the Public Health Act or Ordinance, Chapter 12, Number 4, go to 105, subsection 1. You will see, Madam President, where the statute, the law, provide the types of matters for which regulations are being made. And they are listed, Madam President, if you go to the Public Health Ordinance from A to I. A to I. And Madam President, A to I says that the minister can make regulations if it is, one, to restrain, according to the law, according to the Public Health Act. This is a section that we are amending, Madam President. You can bring regulations for the following purposes only. Only. The restraint, segregation, and isolation of persons suffering from any dangerous, infectious disease or likely from exposure to infection to suffer from any such disease. Madam President, as you go, it deals with the removal to hospital and curative treatment. It deals with the removal, disinfection, and destruction of personal effects. It deals with the speedy burial or cremation of the dead. It deals with house-to-house visitation. It deals with the provision of medical aid and accommodation. It deals with the promotion of cleanliness, ventilation, disinfection. It deals with the prevention of the spread of dangerous infectious diseases. And there's an omnibus provision, I, the doing of any such matter or thing as may appear advisable for preventing or checking such diseases. Madam President, I bring these provisions to your attention because we in this Honorable Senate have to ensure that these regulations that are being made must fall within one of these headings. And I haven't seen any heading that says, Madam President, we have the authority to curtail commercial or business activity of any citizen in the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. If the government wishes to do that, they must amend the primary legislation in order to give effect to new provisions in the area or headings that would allow us to do what we are about to do. And Madam President, I will tell you as I proceed, we have the opportunity to fix this today in this Honorable Senate. Might have been an oversight on the part of the framers or drafters. So, Madam President, the power to curb commercial activity and to run one's business as one sees fit involves, as you know, an intrusion of one's constitutional right to enjoyment of property, which is entrenched and protected under Sections 4 and 5 of our Constitution. Therefore, none of the provisions that I have read out to this Senate specifically or intently give the power to a minister to make regulations, Madam President, to curb commercial activities of businesses and citizens. I haven't seen any thus far. And therefore, Madam President, the Attorney General may wish to argue that the omnibus that I read in Madam President, which is drafted very broadly, one may argue, give the minister the power to do anything, and therefore he can make any regulation as he sees fit. But that would be a flawed argument, an erroneous argument, Madam President. Madam President, from my research, which I did in the last few hours under extensive pressure, the research has shown me, Madam President, that this I, the Roman I, under 105(1)(I), tells me, Madam President, that this type of power is confined to the express wording of the statute. And therefore, the regulations must fall plainly and squarely within one of the subsections. There is a concept called the principle of legality, I'm advised by attorneys, which is a trite canon of statutory construction. I think Senator Vieira might be able to guide me on that. I'm not getting into your arena, sir. I'm far from that. But it states that broad, Madam President, and vague provisions will be construed narrowly and in any event, not in a manner to cut down anyone's constitutional rights. And this is where the principle of legality has come up. Madam President, I looked at a case in the limited time I had, not being a lawyer, although I'm interested in the profession. In a matter titled the Secretary of State for the Home Department, ex parte Sims, Secretary of State for the Home Department, 1999, Lord Huffman, a great jurist, on page 10 of this judgment, summarized the principle of legality and its interplay with the freedom of expression in the following way. I wouldn't be too long on this part of my contribution. Madam President, I quote Lord Huffman, I add only a few words of my own about the importance of the principle of legality in a constitution which, like ours, acknowledges the sovereignty or the sovereignty of Parliament. And it goes on to talk about what parliamentary sovereignty means, that Parliament can, if it chooses, legislate contrary to fundamental principles of human rights. But, Madam President, whatever is done, it cannot be done at the risk that can bring about a disadvantage to the citizens. So what is very important in this provision here is that there are constraints upon its exercise by Parliament. And therefore, Madam President, it's important that in this matter, we look very, very carefully at the implications of this provision that we are about to address. The language in that section, as I said, Madam President, is very ambiguous and vague. And Lord Huffman went on to say, in the absence of express language or necessary
Senator Mark,
implication.
you have 5 more minutes.
Yes, it is important, Madam President, that we pay attention to this question. So, Madam President, what this therefore means is that if these regulations, and if I may close on this, what this case said or decides is that the principle of legality applies to subordinate legislation as much as to acts of Parliament. And what I would like the Attorney General to consider is that since there is no provision under the various headings under 105, which we are amending, that deals with the curtailment of commercial and business activity, this could constitute a grave situation for us as lawmakers. It means, Madam President, that if these regulations are passed in their current form without making the relevant changes, these can be challenged, Madam President, and the principle of legality can be applied in determining whether these broad provisions are enough to curtail the constitutional rights of citizens. So, Madam President, we believe that there is need for some consideration of this matter and some rethinking of this matter to avoid any collision that may result, Madam President, in the citizens and the taxpayers paying large fines for damages if we proceed without making the necessary changes. Madam President, I would like to ask the government, just as how, Madam President, if I want to go and buy a box of KFC, I can go in my community, line up outside, make my order, collect my chicken and chips, return home. KFC, restaurants, they make the money. Why are we seeking to shut down tens of thousands of bars in the country? Why can't we not have, Madam President, the same provision as we have for restaurants being extended to the bars, the liquor license people? Where, Madam President, if I want to buy a bottle of puncheon, because puncheon and lime does wonders, as you know, I want to go and buy a bottle of puncheon, Madam President. There's a bar in my community. Why can't I go and knock on that bar and they give me my puncheon, I pay them the money? Why must you shut down the bar? And, Madam President, when you shut down the bar, it is scores and hundreds of workers who are going to be unemployed. Is the government going to pay? Is the government going to pay those workers who are going to be unemployed for that period? Is the government going to pay me? I happen to be, hypothetically, the owner of a bar. You shut me down. Are you going to pay me for the period of time that you have shut me down, Madam President? These are serious matters. I have a right to enjoyment of my property. And if you are taking away my property, you better compensate me. And if you don't compensate me, I might take you to court. So, Madam President, all I'm saying, we have to do everything to protect our citizens' health. I am for that, and the party is for that. But we must ensure that we do not infringe on people's constitutional rights unless you are bringing the relevant amendments to the legislation for approval. So that is the point I want to leave with this Honorable Senate today. We are for the measures, some of the measures, I'm going to say all of the measures that have been put forward. But what we are saying, Madam President, we need to tighten them up because we don't want the taxpayers to end up in the wrong corner on this particular matter or at the wrong end of this matter. So, Madam President, in closing, I would like the Attorney General to consider some of these submissions that we have made on this side, and I hope that, for instance, in his winding up, he'll be able to deal with some of these issues. I thank you very much, Madam President.
Before I call on Senator Seepersad to speak, I just want to remind senators that the seating was adjusted in the chamber to facilitate social distancing. Some members are now pulling up the seats to chat with their colleagues, and therefore the distance is not being maintained. I'm not naming and shaming at this stage, but I would ask you please to remember, if you want to chat, maybe leave the chamber and maintain your respective distances, but not under my eye, please, in the chamber. So can I see some chairs moving back to where they should be? Senator Seepersad.
Madam President, thank you for the opportunity to contribute to the debate on the bill before us. I'm in support of the measures taken by the government to restrict travel and social interaction so as to reduce or halt the widespread rate of infection by the coronavirus. These measures are necessary to minimize the number of persons requiring medical attention and/or intensive care so that the health facilities are not overwhelmed. The prevailing jargon is to flatten the curve as it pertains to the spread of the virus. Consequences on a personal and national level are already dire. Mitigating the financial effects at the personal level in the short term is vital. Similarly, the national economic nightmare requires a new approach to economic management and leadership. The recovery horizon is still indeterminable, and thinking out of the box towards a different normal may be the way forward. Times like these require courage, intelligence, and compassion. If the Wuhan experience is the benchmark, then the resumption of normal activity is 3 to 6 months from now. But fear and uncertainty are the order of the day. Madam President, I'm very concerned that Trinidad's maritime borders with Venezuela continue to be breached with impunity. According to the World Health Organization, as of March 17, 2010, there were 33 confirmed cases of the coronavirus in Venezuela. It is uncertain that the same degree of medical testing and accurate reporting is done in Venezuela as we do in Trinidad and Tobago. An unknown number of undocumented Venezuelan nationals continue to be smuggled into the country through illegal ports along the Columbus Channel. As recently as March 10, 2020, it was reported that 37 Venezuelans were held in a convoy of vehicles in Cedros, and on March 16, 2020, 29 Venezuelans were held in the same area. According to a report in a Newsday article entitled "Quarantine in Venezuela Stops Travel to TNT," dated today, March 20, 2020, and I quote, "The TT arrival of Venezuelan refugees has been slowed by measures imposed by the governments of both nations and by transportation companies," end quote. This may reduce the number of Venezuelan migrants. However, the exposure and risk must be reviewed with the same vigilance now in effect in the legal / official ports of entry. While I understand the difficulty and constraints in policing this area, more must be done to contain the illegal Venezuelan migrants entering the country. Madam President, personnel with requisite equipment and resources must be deployed for more effective border control. This is a significant crack in the fabric of our efforts in the containment of this world-debilitating virus. Thank you, Madam President.
Senator Dillon-Remy.
Madam President, I would like to thank you to join this debate on this act that the name has already been said, and it's very long, so I won't bother to call it out again. It was in January that the WHO reported that there was this pneumonia of unknown cause that was detected in Wuhan, China, and it was reported to the WHO country office in China, actually on the 31st of December. And we are now at the end, almost at the end of March. And we've had more than 200,000 reported cases with over 8,000 deaths worldwide. It's in 168 countries or territories. The WHO declared this outbreak a public health emergency of international concern on the 30th of January 2020. Madam President, I would like to thank the government for their proactive approach to this crisis. I remember when I heard the early measures with travel bans, that was in January, about banning travel to China, I wondered if this was not too drastic, because after all, at that point in time, we were hearing it was a flu-like illness, and I understand that we have flu all the time, including now, this flu season, and we've been handling it over the years without declaring a public health emergency. However, the fact that this is something new and what has emerged over only 2 months tells me that the action taken by the government at that point in time was the right one. When I see what is happening, as we see in Italy, where the outbreak is now worse than in China, and what is going on right now in the UK and parts of the United States of America, and these are places with excellent healthcare systems, and yet they are being overwhelmed by this outbreak. I do appreciate the measure taken by the government, and I applaud them. Madam President, permit me to wonder a little as to why we were not as proactive in postponing Carnival. And I would say this because Carnival was only 3 weeks ago. And I just wonder, we have just seen the cases that we have in Trinidad now, and the fact that the government is taking the measures that they are taking now in closing places, closing bars, closing schools, restricting travel, etc. I just wonder what may have happened if we had decided to proactively postpone Carnival. I would also like to commend the Prime Minister and the Minister of Health and their team for the openness in treating with the public, in having regular updates and letting people know what is happening. For me, that is one area where we can say that when you put the information out there first, it means that you have less opportunity for the fake news to go around, and I do applaud them for this. We have an issue, though, with trust, and I'm just encouraging all leaders to make sure that whatever is said in the public is something that they know they are going to do, and it is not just being said for the sake of being said, but it is being actioned in the ministries and areas that they are doing it, so that people can say, yes, I believe them, and as a result, I will do, because we know that we have issues with trust. I have a couple questions for the Minister of Health, and it's specifically related to what is happening on the front line with the medical fraternity. And medical means medical and nursing, and all the persons who are at the front line with this, in this outbreak. Right now, there are strict measures for testing, and I know that there are issues related to capacity, and there are issues related to the it is something new, and they probably have a limited number of kits, etc. But I would like the minister to consider, at least put this in the planning, that as soon as it is possible, that there is an opportunity for increasing testing. I'm saying that because currently you are tested if you have been to if you've traveled, if you have been in contact with a person who is known to be COVID positive, or if you have specific symptoms, and that includes things like fever, difficulty breathing, cough, etc. We are telling people that only about 20% of those people may have all those symptoms. In other words, we have another 80% of people who are mild, and they may not have fever, in other words. They may not have respiratory problems, and they may still be carrying the virus, and they would not be tested now. So I'm saying we have made a good start, and I'm happy about that, but we should seriously look at expanding testing as soon as is possible to make sure that we are capturing persons who are not included at this point in time. Let me just say, there was a case as of 2 days ago in one of the healthcare facilities where a frontline worker, not a healthcare worker, but another frontline worker, and we have frontline workers like immigrations, customs, emergency response people, who this person came to the healthcare facility and had a cough and some difficulty breathing, and it was something new for that person. But the person did not have fever. The person did not have a contact, the person did not travel. Neither did the person come in contact with a known COVID case, and therefore did not fit that strict criteria for testing. And at this point in time, that person has not been tested. The ministry is doing what it can and in relation to the guidelines by WHO. But I'm just asking for consideration that the expansion of testing as soon as it is possible, so that persons like this could be addressed. Senator Mark talked about what is going on, what had gone on in South Korea. Those people, they had to make extraordinary changes with what they were doing in terms of testing, their testing protocol. They had to get the kits, they had to do, let's say, things to make sure that they had all the material. They extended the sites for testing, etc., etc. In other words, they had something on their hands that they were dealing with, and they had to have an unprecedented response, and they did. And we are seeing the results of that now. I'm just asking, we're in the early stage, I'm just asking that that be considered. We also look at the frontline staff in terms of testing again, frontline staff. Currently, or frontline, medical and nursing, are exposed. They may be exposed to people right now who are not showing symptoms, and where, therefore, we would need to look at that in terms of testing in the future. We are confidently saying that there's no community spread right now, but how confident can we be when we are not yet testing persons who are in contact with that people, with the persons? Madam President, in relation to, again, the health response, do we have any idea as to what kind of numbers we'll be looking at in terms of the persons who are in the 5 to 10% who will need emergency hospital care? Do we have any idea of what that kind of numbers are at this point in time? Because I think we need to be looking at that. The reason being, again, when we look at what is happening in a very developed country with very excellent healthcare facilities and how they have been overwhelmed, if we plan for that kind of thing while we make sure that we do our preventive measures, we may be ready if it comes, even though we are praying that it does not come. What is the epidemiological modeling to estimate the number of persons who may be in that group? Another question coming from the healthcare professionals is, the ministry has started to try to put two parallel systems in place. But again, the emergency rooms right now are filled with cases that may or may not be COVID, as well as persons who are like the other emergencies. The screening out has not yet happened in all the cases. And again, I appreciate what has happened. We are saying that our services at the level of each region, each hospital, each regional health authority has to come up to scratch in terms of trying to make sure that we indeed run two parallel systems where the persons who may be COVID are separated from those who are not. This is coming from the persons who are on the ground. Currently, employers are asking people to go to the medical practitioners to let them know whether they're COVID, whether they're fit to come into hospital. In other words, a person with a respiratory symptom and the employer is saying, go to the doctor. Make sure they tell you whether you have COVID or not. And we know that that cannot happen. You can't just go to a doctor and let them tell you whether you have COVID or not. You have to be tested, and you have to go through a screening process. It means, therefore, that that right now is not very practical. And we would like to make sure that employers are, as they get involved in this whole response, they are not putting an undue amount of pressure on persons who cannot give the kind of response that they want. If a person has respiratory symptoms, keep them in isolation. That's what the government says. Don't go and send to a doctor, ask if the person can say whether they're COVID or not. They would not be able to tell you. Madam President, the ministry has said, and the modeling that has come from the government has said, that in every area you should have social distances if you have to be in the public. I must say that we should ensure that when this is said at the level of the government, it is actioned at every level down below. Specifically as it relates to our airlines, right now, we are traveling between Trinidad and Tobago on airlines, and right now that social distancing is not being practiced. I'm not sure why, but it is true that it is a short flight, and they're probably doing sanitizing and stuff like that in between. But the social distancing is not being practiced there. Whatever the reason is, I'm not too sure. The airport screening right now is also not as it should be, because people are coming into the country, for instance, from UK and the US, where there's a lot of COVID, and they are not necessarily being told at the level of entry that they need to isolate. That is something I think needs to, the government is saying it, the ministry is saying it, but at the level of point of entry of persons into the community, that is not yet happening, and it is dangerous. Madam President, there is the issue of contact tracing. When we put the persons who are considered possibly COVID, in other words, suspected or positive, we then go through contact tracing. And that is a very detailed process. And the medical professionals are asking whether we are going to use something as rigorous as was used in Singapore, where they used not just the talking and asking for people, but mapping, so that a person could be isolated and known on a map as to where they are. The other thing is that they included large numbers of persons.
Senator Dillon-Remy, if I may, while the bill is treating with coronavirus, and it has specific responses in the bill to that, I'm going to ask you, I've given you a lot of latitude to treat with the issues that you have discussed, but I'm going to have to ask you too, as you continue to move to the matters at hand in the bill, the specific measures. Yeah? Thank you.
Thank you. In relation to the quarantine, as it relates to the public health ordinance, repealing Section 105, the clause number 5 in the bill. I must say that I appreciate that happening, and I understand where Senator Mark was going in terms of looking at the parent bill and indicating that the measures that are being put, at least the regulations that were put, may not specifically relate to this, this section of the bill. But I'm saying that as far as I see it, this is something that is required, because if you had a very small, short, a very low fine as there was before, there is a need, and hopefully this is going to prevent people from. The thing about that, though, is that we know fines don't necessarily cause people to not do something, as we know, and particularly given where we're at in this epidemic, telling a person that they will get to a court or some such thing as a result of breaking a law would not necessarily make them do what they're supposed to do. What we are saying is that we have to be socially responsible and make sure that they are not breaking the law, not because of a law outside, but because of their conscience within. Madam President, the section, and by the way, there are many new things that have come in here since we looked at the bill, but I would ask the minister, the section 3, clause 3 of the bill that talks about filing of the Companies Act is amended and would allow the documents are delivered and filed to the registrar prior to during the report, the period of 27th March to the 31st of July. Is there any such area that is being looked at in terms of personal income tax, which is due on the 30th of April for ordinary taxpayers? Is there any consideration for amendments as far as the income tax, personal income taxes are concerned? The other thing the minister mentioned in clause 4 of the Bill of Sales Act is amended, and it says why it was amended. There is a concern that has been expressed by an attorney as to whether deeds of gift was going to be a part of this, considered for extension to. And the reason for that is that, yes, they have a year in which to do the registration, but there are people who right now may be near the end and have not done it. Is this going to be a part of the amendments also? Madam President, as we have said, we are in unprecedented times and in unprecedented territory. And the minister talked about, the Attorney General talked about the Prime Minister's concern about four-pronged attack with personal, the personal, labor, public and private. I would just like to add to that, there was need for tremendous personal leadership in terms of people taking personal responsibility, and not just for themselves, in terms of preventing the spread of the disease, but also thinking of what they must do to prevent the spread to our elderly, for instance. We saw that in Italy, people did not take on the restrictions early, and right now they cannot hold. In the same place, we are also asking for corporate leadership, where our companies and our businesses are not going to seek to gouge out the eyes of the public because of a crisis, and as a result, we have all these excessive cost of goods, etc. We are hoping here that there's indeed corporate leadership. The government has shown that it's taking leadership for what is happening, and I'm happy about that. My prayer is that it is not just the government, but everybody, and not just government, but government and opposition. And we have to make sure that after COVID, it's not going to be that we are seeing red and yellow, but we'll be seeing red, white, and black in terms of our national response. Madam President, I thank you.
Senator Vieira.
We are here today, a Friday, summoned by the President of the Senate to deal with emergency legislation in the wake of the coronavirus, a dangerous, infectious disease as declared by the President. This is an extraordinary sitting in an extraordinary moment. These nights, the streets are eerily quiet and deserted. Many countries have closed their borders. We sit here unusually spaced in keeping with the oxymoron, social distancing. Court dates have been adjourned to the 20th of April for the time being, and the Chief Justice has directed that time, at least for matters in court, shall cease to run. The moment is surreal. One almost feels as though we're in a zombie apocalypse movie. These circumstances have triggered a call for polarized politics to be put aside momentarily so that we may tackle the crisis on a united front. I agree. We have oversight, whether by asking questions, through the filing of motions, at committee level, and in debate. When the executive and state agencies do wrong or fall short, our duty is to call them out. And we do so, speaking truth to power without fear or favor. By the same token, however, when the executive and state agencies do well, we must also recognize it. In some countries, citizens have been ordered to stay at home. Here, a balance has been sought, one that promotes public safety and well-being, but without shutting down and crippling the country. In some countries, the death toll is in the thousands. Fear and panic is the order of the day, but not here. Today, I want to recognize and commend the executive for an excellent job thus far. Not just in terms of handling the crisis at the public health level, but holistically. And in particular with regard to the social and financial measures designed to support cash flow, inject liquidity into the system, and to manage the impact on the workforce. Among other things, by providing extra resources to support public services and small business, by supporting people affected by COVID-19 and those caring for them in what the AG calls a parallel healthcare facility, by effectively prioritizing and managing potentially conflicting imperatives, and for having the courage to recognize what needs to be done and doing it. The way this has been handled is nothing short of world-class. A grateful nation says thanks. This legislation develops or implements government's contingency plans, taking into account relevant legal and regulatory obligations. In particular, by extending the time for persons to file documents at the company's registry and allowing for an amnesty. This will avoid citizens having to congregate at the company's registry, as we were seeing earlier this week. Similarly, the legislation offers comfort to those whose driving permits are about to expire. Again, this will avoid citizens having to congregate outside licensing offices. Bills of sale must be registered within 7 days of execution, and similar matters which are time-sensitive and carry penalties for non-compliance are now being given a reprieve. The legislation allows such documents to remain valid during this period of extended force majeure. Licenses for cinemas, clubs, theaters, and dance halls about to expire shall be extended to maintain validity. Last but not least, the legislation amplifies the consequences and penalties for those who, in defiance of the Minister of Health's coronavirus regulations, continue to operate bars, clubs, cinemas, and restaurants. Now, I listened with great interest to Senator Mark's points, and the points were good, but I personally don't see any constitutional issues. When you look at the Interpretation Act, Section 75 makes clear that the old public health ordinance is still valid. And when you look at what Section 105 says, the board, and the board under that public health ordinance now means the Minister of Health. The Minister of Health shall have the direction of all measures dealing with dangerous infectious diseases and may make regulations with regard to the control of any dangerous infectious disease for any or all of the following purposes. A, the restraint, segregation, and isolation of persons suffering from any dangerous infectious disease or likely from exposure to infection to suffer from any such disease. And now we talk about the constitutional rights of owners and persons going to bars. Let me just remind this honorable house that bars and restaurants and cinemas, they operate under licenses. Licenses mean you have permission. Permissions can be varied, they can be modified, they can be revoked. So I don't have any difficulty with the measures being proposed. I think that they're necessary and proportionate. But who could have imagined this turn of events barely 3 months ago when we ushered in the new year? This upheaval is even more profound than 9/11. The world will never be the same. I don't know how this will end. No doubt the economy will suffer serious setbacks, but I am confident that we will come out a better people. A crisis is a moment of truth, a turning point, an opportunity. Let us not be like that unnamed jurisdiction where a man was beaten up and thrown out of a taxi because he sneezed. Rather, let us make use of the insights and the opportunities offered by this crisis. Many of us, caught up with the hassles and pressures of daily existence, have sometimes been indifferent to those around us. This is an opportunity to focus on what really matters: the value of a job, the importance of cleanliness, the joy of community and being able to socialize. That good health is a gift which should never be taken for granted. Let us appreciate the often invisible but fundamentally important people who we rely on to help us get by in life. My father was fond of saying, "You don't miss the water until the well runs dry." Well, let's not wait for that to happen. Let us recognize that we can't only live by ourselves. We are connected to our fellow man by thousands of fibers. Let us relish and make full use of the chance to spend precious time with those who are important in our lives. We are a people who like to hug, kiss, and touch. I hope this will not change when normalcy returns. I always maintain that our twin island republic is blessed. We are a special place. We are blessed in so many ways, as demonstrated by the judiciary, our banks, the business community, and civil society, all of whom have acted promptly, decisively, and responsibly. We are not just talented and resourceful, but a compassionate and caring people. I've heard some describe the situation as a war. I can understand the sentiment, but I would rather characterize it as an opportunity for humanity to recalibrate. There is hope. China, Vietnam, South Korea have shown us that this virus can be contained. Every day we are learning more about the virus and how to defeat it. I am confident that a vaccine is probably not too long in the offing. So let us not take counsel of our fears and the naysayers. Rather, let us recognize that when we help each other, everybody wins. Do not let what you cannot do interfere with what you can do. I find the legislation clear, straightforward, and proportionate. It is necessary, and it has my support. It buys time for compliance and time for our healthcare system. Let us use that time for reflection, self-improvement, and reconnection. I thank you.
Senator Ameen.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Please permit me to read a few lines from poet Kitty O'Meara, which has gone viral worldwide during this COVID-19 pandemic. And it goes like this. And the people stayed home and read books and listened and rested and exercised and made art and played games and learned new ways of being and were still and listened more deeply. Some meditated, some prayed, some danced, some met their shadows, and the people began to think differently. This previously unknown poet has been deemed the poet laureate of this pandemic. And I think it's because this poem sort of inserts the idea back into us as individuals that this pandemic, which is something out of control, that we will get through it. And it imagines that a time after will not only exist, but that it will be better. Today, the Parliament of Trinidad and Tobago, both the House of Representatives and the Senate, meet for an extraordinary sitting to approve measures for the special period of the COVID-19 pandemic. The Opposition United National Congress is committed to the protection, safety, and well-being of all our citizens, and we remain committed to supporting good law. The purpose of the measures before us is to prevent congregating and to lessen social contact, to reduce the possible spread of COVID-19 in this country, which we are in support of. Madam President, a legal notice has been published under the Public Health Ordinance, which deals with clubs, restaurants, and bars. And, Madam President, as primary places of congregation. And in addition to the issue which was raised by Senator Mark, places of worship, churches, mosques, temples, whatever religion, and malls. Madam President, I think it's very important for us, after the government has attempted to use moral suasion, and we have seen that citizens are, by and large, not adhering to this lack of congregation. There is technology that can be used in customer-intensive businesses in order to prevent congregating, which would allow commercial activities to continue. And so many supermarkets, restaurants are announcing takeout, takeaway, and curbside services. And as far as possible, in all businesses, supermarkets, restaurants, bars, pharmacies, there is the need to discontinue large groups of people coming into the establishment. But, Madam President, we also must reduce the need to terminate employees and preserve jobs. Even within the confines of the law, some speakers before me would have mentioned, the government may have limited authority to restrict certain commercial activities on private premises. But when it comes to operating, even if the government cannot put laws in place, I think it will be useful to provide some clear guidelines in certain areas. So, for example, I know announcements were made previously. The banks, which are more organized than many businesses, which I'll go to shortly, the banks have made a decision, a policy decision, which guides all of them with regards to deferral of loan payments, with regards to credit card interest rates, with regards to increasing overdraft facility, and this will be very useful for small businesses in particular. But, Madam President, that same type of guideline, those same types of guidelines would be useful in other areas, such as the clarity with regards to pandemic leave and temporary unemployment, guidelines for landlords of private properties. Businesses, there are two categories of businesses. There will be those who will be forced to close based on the measures in this, not only today, the measures that will come today, but the measures that will come in this period. There are some businesses that will be forced to close. And so, if they have to pay any rent, it will come out of whatever savings they have, if they have any. But there will be businesses that continue to operate, but are not going to generate the revenue that they usually do. So a landlord may be mindful, because that's all we could ask them to do now, be mindful, and defer the payment of rent for a business that is forced to close. But it also means that they are giving up their income as landlords. But there will be businesses who will continue to operate. Would those landlords be mindful to not collect a rent or to collect a reduced rent? So there is so much space and room, because it is only suggestions that are coming forward. And I think it would be very useful for guidelines to come forward. I don't know if the Minister of Labor intends to speak in today's debate, but I know that announcements were made with regards to leave and employees, and some guidelines for employers, and many employers are still awaiting further clarification, which I myself look forward to. Madam President, the government has indicated, and I think the Attorney General repeated today, that the government is not in a position to give what is essentially handouts. In some countries, small businesses are being given grants to pay employees, for example. They're just to cover their employees' salaries. Even where loans are provided, these loans still have to be repaid. So it's still a cost to the business. And of course, you always have to consider the small businesses. Which is why it is imperative that this government puts measures in place that will not lead to job losses, that will consider the preservation of jobs in every sector. We don't know how long this pandemic will last. We cannot prepare lightly. We cannot treat it as mild. The nature of this virus gives you a period of incubation in the body of 2 weeks. And so an infected person who may show no symptoms could walk around for 2 weeks and contaminate other persons, pass on the disease to other persons they come in contact with. So at any given time, in every country, the number of actual cases will be more than the number of confirmed cases. And bearing that in mind, we cannot only count on the number of confirmed cases to tell ourselves whether we are at risk or whether this thing is over. I saw, Madam President, there's so much news coverage internationally on this COVID-19 pandemic. And I saw an interview on one of those stations, I can't remember if it was BBC or CNN or one of them, where a representative of the World Health Organization in an interview was saying that the lethargic response by authorities and individuals was cited as being the #1 cause of rapid increase of instances of COVID-19. And in Trinidad and Tobago, we have such a laid-back culture. It is something that we are praised for in the tourism industry, for instance, but it can be both a blessing and a curse. This is a pandemic. This is not mild. This is serious business. Governments, businesses, and individuals must be responsible and decisive. The Guardian yesterday, Madam President, yesterday, which was Thursday the 19th, the Chief Medical Officer of Health, the CMOH, let me commend Dr. Roshan Parasram for his service to Trinidad and Tobago in this pandemic. Dr. Parasram told the nation during a post-cabinet meeting yesterday that contact tracing undertaken on one of this country's 9 confirmed COVID-19 cases revealed that that individual had been in contact with 66 people while carrying the virus. One person. We must continue, while we reiterate the message of minimizing social contact, we must also lead by example. I want to endorse the contribution from Dr. Remy, Senator Dr. Dillon-Remy, with regards to reviewing the protocol for qualification for testing of persons for COVID-19 virus. We must intensify the contact tracing and encourage self-isolation and further testing. That is the only way, Madam President, that is, to me, one of the key measures that countries that seem to be over the worst of it, countries who are having less and less new cases every day, that is one of the common denominators in how they approach this fight against COVID-19. Test, 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 according to the WHO. So, Madam President, I know that there will be further measures to be brought to this Parliament. There are some concerns I have with statutory payments. This bill, Madam President, deals with the licensing, several licenses and so on, bill of sales, cinema, clubs, theaters, and so on, licenses. But, Madam President, there are still questions with regards to payments of VAT, personal income tax, national insurance, that would be very relevant to businesses, to employers, and to employees. The issue of how employees can be covered during their time of absence, and maybe it is time for us as a nation to look at measures for the national insurance, which every citizen who is employed is covered by, to cater for situations like this. There are people who pay national insurance contributions religiously and have never had use of their service. And in a time after they have so many millions of dollars in profits, I believe that that might be an avenue for us to explore to cover citizens who pay a national insurance contributions in a time like this. So, Madam President, may I close with the final verse of that poem by Kitty O'Meara, which I love so much. And when the danger passed, the people joined it together again. They grieved their losses and made choices and dreamed new images and created new ways to live and heal the earth fully as they had been healed. This pandemic will pass. May God bless Trinidad and Tobago. I thank you.
Leader of Government Business.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Madam President. And I want to open, Madam President, by thanking you for obliging us with this extraordinary sitting in circumstances which have been very well articulated. I want to thank the Honorable Attorney General and his staff. As you know, we already have a very heavy legislative agenda, which has continued while the AG and his staff have had to deal with a number of legal issues, some existing and some likely to come up, and grapple with it. And this bill tells us one thing: we are really dealing with some ancient legislation in this country. I want to thank the parliamentary staff for being here to support us on what is a historic day when both houses sit on the same day, on the same bill. Madam President, I listened to my colleague, Senator Ameen. We are legislating and we are managing one thing and one thing only, and that is this thing called uncertainty. This is not an earthquake that has happened, or a tropical storm or a hurricane that has gone, leaving debris and issues for us to deal with. We don't know whether this is to come or whether it has gone. And the legislation, one of many, I'm sure, that we'll have to deal with, deals with the uncertainty that this pandemic has brought, not to this country, but to this world. Senator Vieira, you use words that resonate with me: zombie, apocalypse, extraordinary and surreal. I was on Arapita Avenue last night at my favorite food outlet, and it was surreal. This curbside dining, something that even after going through 1990 and going through all sorts of things in this country is really unprecedented to me. Thankfully, my last debate I referred to John Grisham. Thankfully, I have children who introduced me to zombie books and apocalypse books and forced me to go back to Stephen King, The Stand, and China Syndrome, and more recently, as Senator Ameen knows, Rick Riordan, a favorite of her own son. So I think I myself was preparing for the zombies and the apocalypse, but we could never really prepare for it. And I think that is what we're really fighting, this issue of uncertainty. And to put things in context, I appreciate Senator Ameen's concern about jobs. The government has articulated some principles, and one principle that has come out very clear is that we do not wish as a government to see anybody go under. we are in this together as a country. It has met us at a time when we really wish it didn't happen. We're already in very, very difficult waters. But we've said to the country that together we have to work through this one. You've seen what happened with the airlines. In this country, we're talking about billions right now. The United States, in one measure, is talking about $1 trillion. And the numbers from the airline companies, they're unprecedented. Very early on, in the first 2 or 3 days, WestJet, which is an employee-owned airline, very unique. Good investors don't invest in airlines. And WestJet is employee-owned. And in the first 2 days, they announced that they would not survive this. They would start off with a 50% staff cut. So it's unprecedented. In California and New York, in California, I was astonished. Apart from 40 million persons being asked and ordered to stay home, the data shows that unless that is followed, in 8 weeks, California could have about 25.5 million infections. And the governor in New York has just taken that step also, to ask New Yorkers in all non-essential businesses to stay home. And those two measures in those two states means that 1 in 5 American, 1 in every 5 American is asked to stay at home. So we have brought this bill in those circumstances. There are 10 pieces of legislation that will be affected by it. But the bill is driven, in my mind, by 3 simple principles. And I've decided to make this contribution not only in support of what the AG has brought to us, but also for the country to understand very clearly the context in which we've brought this bill, and we may likely bring other pieces of legislation. And the first principle is to address the issue of crowding. You know, you can't legislate common sense, but the science has shown us that the further apart we are, the more likely it is we would survive this pandemic. So we're trying to keep people from forming themselves into crowds. That's the first principle. So anything that is likely to cause crowding, and I'll use the word congregation, we have to address that. And we also have to deal with unnecessary movement. I saw some photos this morning from Shark River, for example. So even as we took steps to address the Cora issue, we now have to deal with the Shark River issue. And I'll tell you about the Cora issue. You see, if we go along the lines of Senator Mark, and he's entitled to do that, and Senator Ameen, as she touched on it, on this, the authority in law, and whether the authority is crystal clear. Well, I'll tell you, Cora is not a national park in law. It is designated as a national park. Forestry Division has authority over it, but it's authority on paper. If we had to take the action that we wanted to take, I would have said it's state land under the Commissioner of State Lands, and perhaps the Commissioner of State Land could prohibit entry into it. But we're doing all of that because some people cannot act in accordance with common sense. And we've had to go either in the absence of law or into ancient law to find something, some stick that we could beat sense into people whose lives we're trying to save collectively. And that is why we're here, essentially. And that is why we may have to return here. And it tells us that our laws have not really prepared itself for something called a pandemic. And that is why we still have in the law infectious diseases and malaria and yellow fever and typhoid and cholera and polio, chicken pox. We really did not prepare ourselves for coronavirus in the context of the law. But this would leave us far better prepared in the future. Madam President, the bill itself has in my mind 6 very clear objectives. And the objectives arise from the circumstances in which we find ourselves. And the 6 objectives are in relation to the issue of validity, preservation of validity or the creation of validity when none will exist, the issue of amnesty, something with which we are familiar, having dealt with amnesty in the context of the Companies Act and other pieces of legislation before. The issue of avoidance of penalties, because in the Companies Act, for example, if you fail to meet a statutory deadline, penalties would accrue by day. 4, in the context of revalidation, because the bills of sale which expire and cannot be renewed as is required in that legislation requires revalidation. Abridgment of time. Bills of sale must be registered within 7 days. And if we don't register a bill of sale within 7 days, an application to the court is necessary. So to avoid that, time has to be abridged. The running of the 7 days will occur at a date in the future, after the end of July 2020. And finally, the issue of penalties, because as the AG has articulated, the sort of behavior we want to discourage will not be discouraged by $480. $50,000 may be a better fine that would cause some people to address their minds to common sense behavior. So, Madam President, in relation to the issue of validation, when the Attorney General started to discuss this particular bill, the one that stuck out for me was this issue of the licensing regime for motor vehicles. Because what we'd find ourselves facing, we'd find ourselves with families who need to move or need to have mobility. We may find ourselves with somebody, and somebody's driver's permit is going to expire next week. And it would not be one person. Between Monday and Friday next week, hundreds of permits will expire. And it is not just the risk of a permit expiring and somebody being stopped by the police. A police officer may waive such a breach, but an insurance company will not honor a claim arising out of somebody driving with an expired driver's permit. And that, to me, is the real risk that we must protect, because we have 800,000 vehicles on the road, many of them owned and operated by persons who are in families. And families in circumstances like this need to be mobile, or need at least to have the opportunity to be mobile. So in relation to Clause 2 of the bill and the introduction of the new 61B, we are allowing, during this period, and the period is set 27 March 2020 to 31st July 2020, during that period, not only driver's permits, but other documents issued by the licensing office, certificates, badges, licenses, the validity will be maintained during that period, notwithstanding that it has passed the expiration date. And for insurance purposes, the person will remain covered. The second thing addressed by Clause 2 is in relation to transfers, and the transfers which are required. We don't always comply with it in law, but the law strictly sets out a period of time within the transfer of vehicle must be completed and the registration of the new owner must be endorsed. And that also is extended. So that is in relation to validity, that the bill preserves validity through Clause 2 in relation to things that are controlled by the licensing of motor vehicles regime in the country. In relation to penalties and the avoidance of penalties, Clause 3 deals with the Companies Act which I've referred to. So those documents and those things which are supposed to be filed, statutory documents in relation to the Companies Act that are supposed to be filed within a particular time, they may not be something that attracts criminal sanction as not having a valid driver's permit or consequences in relation to insurance. But the penalties are set out in the statute in relation to failure to lodge a document or register something within a prescribed time frame. And Clause 3 of the bill introduces in relation to the Companies Act the preservation of that position and the avoidance of penalties where you fail to do something that is required during the period 27 March 2020 to 31st July 2020. The Bill of Sale Act, as I have said, what is proposed in Clause 4 of this bill does two things in particular. Historically, the 7-day requirement for registration of a bill of sale has posed a lot of problems to solicitors in particular, busy solicitors who have the work from the banks and the other lenders to execute bills of sale to preserve the security of the lender. And very often, solicitors find themselves before the court having failed to register something within the 7-day time limit. And the 7 days really recognizing the need to strike the balance, particularly in favor of the lender to have the loan that was given securitized in the form of a chattel or something else of that nature. The registration, so even in normal times, I'm sure maybe 30% of the bills of sale which are executed in normal time find themselves outside of the 7-day period. And in these times where I've said before, we do not wish to have people crowding and congregating and being moving unnecessarily, the Attorney General believes that this is a significant measure. And what it does, the 7-day period kicks in later down the road. So that 7-day period will run at a date in the future which is set out in the bill. That, of course, works alongside the measure set out in the practice directions relating to the closure of the court. So you have the 7-day limit. It passes because you can't register it, and then you do not have access to the court during this period when the court is providing limited services and functions. The other part of the bill of sale has to do with the concept of renewal and revalidation, and that is for an existing bill of sale, which has expired, for it to remain, the registration to remain valid during a period where it may not be possible to re-register the bill of sale. And again, the requirement for re-registration during a prescribed period kicks in at a later period which is prescribed, which is after 31st July 2020. Clause 5 of the bill is the one that introduces penalties, and I've referred to that, to increase the fine from $480 to $50,000 and a term of imprisonment not exceeding 6 months. And from clause 6 to 12, Madam President, those clauses deals with 7 different pieces of legislation. Some of them ancient to the point that I heard several persons in the other place this morning trying to pronounce the legislation that governs cinemas, the cinema legislation. Several people tripped up on it, and it's an old piece of legislation. And from 6 to 12, those 7 pieces of legislation, 7 acts, what is prescribed is the same thing. That is, allowing licenses granted under those pieces of legislation to maintain their validity during a period in which it will normally expire, and to allow the persons who hold those licenses to renew them at a later stage without facing any penalty. And the Registration of Clubs Act is something that I must say, I did not expect so much confusion to reign on this one. I myself have had to provide some pro bono advice. AG, maybe you'll talk about it because people have asked me about gyms and about other things. I know specifically the one that we think of comes to mind right away is, of course, members club, what we call in this country casinos, and recreation clubs, because people don't realize when you go into a recreation club, also known as a rum shop or a bar, you're supposed to enter your name on a book, and you're supposed to be brought there by a member of the club. So we have those things, and then we have things that may appear to be clubs, because I asked in being the devil's advocate, what about Price Mart, and what about the grocery we know as Price Club? Yeah, membership organizations, but they remain open. Maybe AG, you'd tell us something about registration of clubs, because I don't want to be answering the questions. Theaters and Dance Halls Act, ancient legislation, the Money Lenders Act, Pawnbrokers Act, licensing of dealers, precious metals and stones, and the Old Metal Marine Stores Act at clause 12. From 6 to 12, what is proposed is very similar. In fact, the Honorable Opposition Leader asked that question in the other place this morning, and it is the AG answer that is the same provision. Madam President, let me just refer to Senator Mark's concern. Senator Mark talked about the malls and the churches and the funerals. Of course, the Prime Minister in the press conference that is going on parallel to our sitting, my understanding is that over and over, the Prime Minister has been exhorting persons in this country to be responsible, to do the responsible thing. I myself saw the photo of the church in full swing. I think we should be more responsible than that. But I will say, and Senator Vieira made the point in relation to what Senator Mark has said, that sometimes we forget that things like bars and restaurants and a lot of these business places really operate within a statutory regime. In fact, the bars and food outlets, bars in particular, the licensing committee in the magistracy is structured, recognizing you have so many things interfacing in a bar, including health issues, local health issues, and the licensing regime is underpinned by health obligations in this case. And that is the reason why local health has a role in signing off the forms, the plans, but also being part of the committee that decides on the application. So a lot of these businesses operate within a statutory regime. And as we know, these fundamental rights to which a lot of people refer are not absolute rights. And I don't think that it would be unreasonable, and I don't think it would be something that any court will find to be unconscionable and something to be unconstitutional when a Minister of Health, in response to a global pandemic which has taken thousands and thousands of lives, act in accordance with the statutory underpinning of licenses which have been granted and makes an intervention in the interest of not only health, but in the interest of common sense. I thank you very much, Madam President.
Honourable Senators, at this juncture, the sitting will be suspended and we will return at 5 p.m. When we return, Senator Hussain will make his contribution. So the sitting is suspended until 5 p.m.